I try to imagine a fellow smarter than myself, and then I try to think, what would he do?
Charge up your axons, ready your receptors, and shift your lobes into upper beta phase. You are listening to Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast dedicated to helping you optimize your brain with the latest breakthroughs in neuroscience, nootropics, and psychopharmacology.
Hello and welcome to Smart Drug Smarts. My name is Jesse Lawler. I am your host, and this is the 92nd episode of this podcast dedicated to the ongoing improvement of your brain, my brain, all our brains by any and all means at our collective disposal. This week is an episode that's it's been coming for probably about 2 months now, but I didn't want to have it right on the heels of its related sister episode. But as you know, if you're a regular listener, we just recently released 2 supplement stacks, Nexus and Mitogen. We had an episode on Mitogen a few weeks ago. Mitogen is a mitochondrial enhancement stack, and Nexus we had not gotten to yet. Nexus is a strict cognitive stack built around aniracetam. And we talked about it a bit, but we hadn't really kind of done the deep dive. This is going to be the deep dive episode. I'm going to be talking with stack designer Abelard Lindsay, who is making his 3rd appearance on Smart Drug Smarts. I think other than me, he's the only person to appear on 3 separate episodes, for which he will receive an amazing Smart Drug Smarts t-shirt valued at approximately $12. Now, I should put a large asterisk next to this episode that both Abelard and I have a financial interest in the stack that we are going to be talking about, so bear that in mind. But I'll put the asterisk on that asterisk that basically the Nexus stack is a consolidation of things that both of us had in our medicine cabinets and really liked a lot and wanted to sort of formalize into a specific, easily shareable type of product, which is exactly what Nexus is. So we're going to be diving into the 4 ingredients, why they were chosen, why they're synergistic and work together, and that will be our main interview. If you hang around until the very end of the episode, in the ruthless listener retention gimmick, I'm going to tell you something that's just disgusting about new mothers. And yeah, I know it's a taboo to say anything nasty at all about new mothers, but I'm just going to violate protocol and risk it. But that'll be at the very end of the episode. To kick things off, let's start as usual with This Week in Neuroscience.
Smart Drug Smarts, This Week in Neuroscience.
So in an interesting recent study at Duke University, researchers found that exercising self-control seems to weaken the ability to lay down memories. So the study was looking at response inhibition. So what that is the ability of brains to keep from doing something, in particular to suppress like motor cortex actions that would normally take place. So if you think of those like crime shows where the SWAT team is testing their shooting abilities as they go through some sort of room where there's a bunch of stand-up cardboard cutouts of bad guys with guns, but then every now and then there's a hostage and they're supposed to shoot all the bad guys but not shoot the hostage. And they get points if they shoot the bad guys correctly, but they lose if they shoot the hostage. So the not shooting the hostage is an example of response inhibition. They're sort of going through, shooting everything in sight, but wait, not that one. And what researchers found is that when we inhibit our responses in a way such as that, we oftentimes have a hard time remembering the details of whatever the stimulus was that caused us to inhibit our response in the first place. So while we might succeed in not shooting the hostage, we also might not remember the details of the hostage as well as we would normally remember the details of one of the bad guys who we did shoot without having to inhibit our shoot everybody that we see response. I don't know why I made this such an unnecessarily violent example. I apologize. In the study that they did at Duke, they showed people flashcards of male and female faces. And some people, they said, press a button every time you see a male face. Don't press a button every time you see a female face. They swapped it for other people so there wouldn't be any sex bias. And then a few minutes later, they showed people a different assortment of male and female faces and asked them, hey, was this face part of the earlier study that you did? And it turned out that people had a harder time remembering whether they had seen a face before if they'd had to inhibit their button pushing for that face versus if they'd been allowed to actually push the button for that face. So why is this inhibition of memory happening? Apparently, an area of the brain called the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex, which is normally active when a person is committing something to memory, was having its activity suppressed when the study participants had to inhibit their responses. This all seems a bit esoteric, and it's hard to imagine how this might relate to the real world, but the scientists point out that this might have a lot to do with ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Students who have ADHD are well known for fiddling around in class, tapping their toes, waving their arms, generally physically moving around in ways that they shouldn't, and of course, they're probably trying to control those tendencies and force themselves to sit still and exerting effort to force themselves to sit still. And that inhibitory response, that forcing themselves to sit still, could, just as we saw in this study, be hampering their ability to lay down new memories and partially be to blame for these students' poorer than average scholastic performance. Now, a couple of weeks ago, you might remember we did the Ritalin self-experiment episode where I did methylphenidate for the first time ever, and we had several other people that chimed in with their first-person experiences of having used Ritalin either in an ongoing way or at least once or twice. And just after that episode, I had a listener that reached out and said that he'd like to do a similar episode around Adderall. I'm not sure if I'm actually going to take any Adderall myself. I can conclusively say that at the moment I have not yet scored myself any Adderall pills, so I would need to hunt one down somehow if I were actually going to participate in that experiment. But more importantly and more to the point, a lot of listeners have emailed in and said, hey, I'd be willing to give my thoughts on this particular chemical in a subsequent episode. So I think that an episode around Adderall will be coming together sometime soon. I want to thank everybody that listened up and emailed in, which is probably a good excuse for me to bang the gong on the Smart Drug Smarts suggestion box page. That's under our Contact Us menu on the website. There's a suggestion box link. And if you got something that you're jonesing to hear an episode on, let us know. There's a little bit of a list. We got a little bit of a backlog, but we do really consider everything that comes in and oftentimes run around like chickens with our cognitively enhanced heads cut off, trying to find relevant experts for whatever it is that you guys come up with. So keep the suggestions coming. And of course, the obligatory reminder, if you're not yet a member of the Smart Drug Smarts email list, I know that Rhiannon has her trigger finger on the send button for a couple of emails that she's about to blast out to that. You can sign up through your mobile phone if you're in the US by texting the letters SDS to phone number 33733, or you can just enter your email address at the smartdrugsmarts.com website. The little fill-in-the-blank box there will not be hard to find, guaranteed. Also, I would like to throw out a quick thank you to Ben Greenfield, fellow podcaster. He has a very, very popular health and fitness podcast, and he was kind enough to actually interview me, so I was on the opposite end of the microphone from that which I normally find myself in an episode of his show that came out last week. If you want to hear some personal Jesse stories, things like a bicycle ride that I did across the southern tier of the United States, or my failed attempt at polyphasic sleeping, or any of the other weird self-experiments that I've done, we'll put up a link to that episode of his show, and you can check that out. And if you're one of the crazy people that actually listens all the way till the end of the episodes and picks up the ruthless listener retention gimmick and the outro and all that stuff every week, you know that I always say something along the lines of, hey, will you tell a friend about Smart Drug Smarts, blah, blah, blah. And apparently you're doing that. At least somebody's doing that. Some benefactor or benefactors are doing a great job of letting the world know that Smart Drug Smarts exists, because month after month after month, we're seeing our numbers go up as far as the total number of listeners. The month of August was our very, very biggest month ever. And before that, the month of July was our very, very biggest month ever. And before that, the month of June was our anyway, you see what I'm saying here. Hopefully that trend will continue in September, but either way, we just really, really appreciate everybody for putting the word out there. It makes our brains happy that we're apparently making your brain happy, so it is just a big podcasty love fest. Anyway, on with the show, here we go.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So when last we met Abelard Lindsay, it was about 7 weeks ago, and we were talking then about the stack mitogen. Abelard, you may remember, is a citizen biohacker. He's a software developer by day, biohacker by night. Abelard Lindsay is not actually his real name. It's a pen name, pseudonym sort of thing that he first used on the longecity.org online forum, which is devoted to things like life extension and nootropics. And he gained such notoriety on that forum a couple of years ago with his invention of a stack called Siltep that at this point, everything that he does in the nootropics world, he goes by the Abelard Lindsay nomenclature. So that's what we'll be using today. Although if pressed, he will admit that his real name is actually Justin. Today we're going to be talking about Nexus. Nexus is our cognitive stack. It's got aniracetam, phosphatidylserine, pycnogenol, and CDP-choline, and we'll be talking about each of those in turn, why they were selected, some of the synergistic effects between them, and probably most importantly, what some of the subjective effects are that you'll feel as you take Nexus. For those of you that want to join in the Smart Drug Smarts play-at-home game, both Nexus and its sister stack Mitogen can be found online at axonlabs.io. That's axonlabs.io. Or you can just go to smartdrugsmarts.com and look for the shop link in the header bar. The serving size on the container, by the way, says 2 pills. Some people only take 1 and that's enough. Some people take more than 2 over the course of the day. I've taken 3 in a day before. And nothing in there is really anything that you can take too much of. All the ingredients are well tolerated by the body, so probably the most important word of warning is don't take it too close to your bedtime because it could keep you awake. But the effects of Nexus are actually going to drain out of your system even faster than caffeine does. I think caffeine has like a 6-hour half-life, and Nexus seems to be about a 3 to 5 hour period of acute effects for most people. So as with anything else, start slow, go by baby steps, see how it works for you, and then edge your way up to a level that seems optimal. But with no further ado, let's jump in with Abelard Lindsay. When you come up with new stack designs, when you're sort of doing your research, what's your entry point when you're looking at the blank page?
I usually start out reading review articles, general overviews, and yes, Wikipedia, for things I'm trying to optimize. And then I start looking at the citations, the actual medical studies, and then I dive into that and just keep going, and then I'll come up with different ideas about how these systems work and how to optimize them. And I've got a lot of facts and odds and ends of supplement trivia from all my years of reading that I tie into these things, reading and experimenting. And then once I come up with an idea for how to create a synergy or a complementary set of supplements that would work together to support a particular area, I try them out, and then I go and do a lot of my quantified self stuff with Cambridge Brain Sciences, or just measuring my athletic performance, or how I do on the weights, and then go from there.
Some people are much stronger responders than others to certain supplements, and it's interesting because as a stack designer, if you found yourself to be a non-responder to something, you might miss something that might be really useful for some other people. Have you come across anything that you're a non-responder to that from the literature other people might respond well to, and that might create a blind spot for you potentially?
And there's some supplements that have really bad reactions to. Like I took Yohimbe once. I felt really, really bad for a couple of hours and got really freaked out. Some people like that supplement. So there's all kinds of different ways that people respond to things. When I take phenylpiracetam, I can't visualize things very well. It's sort of like that part of my brain turns off.
Like spatial objects?
Well, if I'm reading a book and I'm trying to visualize this fictional scene that they're describing in the book, it just doesn't work. It just kind of evaporates when I take phenylpiracetam. And so other people love it and they say it works great, and it's certainly good for athletic performance.
And phenylpiracetam, for those that might not be familiar, that's one of the ones that has a conspicuously low dosage for the amount of efficacy.
Right. It's a strong one, and it's actually banned in professional sports. There are a lot of different things that influence people's reactions to supplements. I mean, there's people who are non-responders to modafinil. There's something to do with the theory about the mineral corticoid receptors and people's response to cortisol that determines their response to piracetam. There's a lot of genetic variability that causes different effects in different people, and also a lot of these studies for nootropics were done in older individuals who were experiencing memory loss or slight dementia and so forth, and they had a greater effect as far as reversing the negative effects of their conditions.
I think that's generally true of most nootropics, is the more things there are wrong to fix, the more potential upside there is. And that's kind of an interesting point, because a lot of the things people are doing to enhance their brain are not necessarily extending their brain beyond what it might be physically capable of, like taking them well beyond their potential cognitive maximum. It's more helping them get to their cognitive maximum and stay there for a longer period of time.
Right. And just to increase mental endurance and so forth, which is important. I mean, some people could extend the length of how long they can concentrate or how much energy they have to study, that kind of thing, yeah.
Question about one of the compounds within Nexus is phosphatidylserine. This is one of these compounds that once I recognized everything that it can do, I was really surprised, and I still am, that it isn't better known by people. Any theories as to why some of these compounds are not more household names?
Phosphatidylserine was, originally there were a lot of good studies that came out about it, and then they switched from bovine source to soy source, and there was a study that came out that said it wasn't effective. At that point, a lot of people dismissed it, but then there were a lot of later studies that came out that said that it was effective, and so this one negative study was quoted for a while, and so it's been off the radar for a while. Also, there was later research that showed that it was synergistic with fish oils, and that was something that was interesting, that maybe there's some confounded diet if people are getting the right fats combined with phosphatidylserine, that it's having a greater effect.
There's also probably quite a bit of variability based on sort of the standard diet that a person's eating and their microbiome and things like that. Can you speak about that a little?
Well, yeah, the microbiome is really important. In the gut, certain microbes generate butyrate, which is a precursor for GABA, and that has a significant cognitive effect. There's also a lot of nerve cells in the gut, and a lot of serotonin is produced in the gut and interacts with those nerve cells. And there's been a lot of research into the relationship between the gut and the brain these days.
So we've gotten a lot of questions from people about Nexus and Mitogen, kind of the best practices of when to take them, how much to take them, what they interact with as far as sleep and exercise. What are your sort of protocols around those two stacks?
Well, I take mitogen once in the morning and also take Nexus in the morning. And if I need to work in the afternoon, I take it again around 3 or 4 p.m. if I'm working late. If I'm still awake and just want to get some sleep at night, I usually take GABA. And in the morning, I take fish oil with my Nexus. I mean, fish oil, if you really want to do it right, you got to take a bunch of pills. And even though I think fish oil is really synergistic with Nexus, it's not going to fit in 3 pills. These omega-3 pills I have, they're kind of horse pills. If you bring the fish oil to the Nexus stack, then you have CDP choline, which increases the level of uridine and choline in the brain. So that sort of brings all that together.
When I look at my handful of pills in the morning, by sheer volume, definitely fish oil wins over everything else combined just because they're big pills.
Right. So I would have included fish oil and Nexus, but just the practicalities of these gigantic gel pills. And if you look at the recommended dose, it just says to take several of them.
Here's a question. So you've been tinkering around with your stacks for a long time. It sounds like you've sort of zeroed in at this point on kind of your perfect day in, day out stack. Is there any sense of a letdown? Like I think about getting to the end of a book that I've really loved. And is there ever any sense of that with where you've brought your nootropics to now?
I mean, there's always new news coming out on nootropics. There's a lot of research constantly going on. And lately, there's been a lot of interesting stuff coming up. People are going and digging up these old studies. There was this one PRL 853 that was studied in the late 70s. And then people dug up the old recipe and they had it manufactured. And also nutrition and supplementation and just health in general is an extraordinarily broad topic. So if I got bored with cognitive performance, I could go and look at pre-workout and post-workout stacks or try solving the metabolic issues or whatever. I mean, there's just so much to research. And there's tens and hundreds of thousands of medical studies out there. Just to get through all of it in a small topic is a lifelong pursuit. So I don't think I'm going to ever be done with studying this, especially with new information constantly coming out.
Going back to Nexus for a minute, the supplement at the heart of that is aniracetam, and one of the main upsides of aniracetam is the memory benefits that come with it. Can you talk a little about what's actually going on at the cellular level that's leading to those memory enhancements?
Sure. So the neurons in the brain, they're all connected to each other at the synapse through these little gaps between them, and at the synapse there's these AMPA receptors. They're called that because they're stimulated by this synthetic AMPA chemical, but also they're stimulated by glutamate. You don't want to mess with glutamate because if you get too much glutamate in your brain, it causes excitotoxicity, which is a form of brain damage. So anyway, when glutamate binds to these AMPA receptors, it makes them open up and they let ions in and out of the neuron, and this causes the electrical properties to change and basically increases the transmission of electrical signals that are going around the brain. The best analogy I could think of for this whole thing is retweeting.
We're talking like Twitter here, yeah?
Yeah, like Twitter. As the impulses come in, which are tweets from people you're following, start retweeting their tweets, so those electrical signals will propagate more strongly. That's sort of like there's been a tetanic stimulation, which is like a series of electrical pulses that have hit the AMPA receptor that have caused a little magnesium ion pop out of the NMDA receptor and calcium to stream in. And once calcium comes in, it starts phosphorylating the AMPA receptors, which make them more active, and it also starts recruiting AMPA receptors to the synaptic cleft, so it's making stronger connections. This is early long-term potentiation, memory that lasts up to 3 hours. Now, aniracetam is kind of like your Twitter account becomes famous, and when you receive tweets and retweet them, they travel further and further around. So now if you think about this whole retweeting thing where ideas are propagating, it creates culture, it creates reality. And these electrical signals are magnified in the brain and propagate through the neuronal networks is what creates thought. So Twitter kind of creates thought on the civilizational, techno-geek level, and long-term potentiation and neuronal firing creates thought on the personal level, if you will.
One of the phrases that gets tossed around is neurons that fire together, wire together. Is this essentially sort of what's going on under the hood in that process?
Yeah, it's like there can either be a really strong signal from one neuron to another, or there can be a bunch of weaker signals that are aggregated that also increase this connection. It's basically the strength of the electrical signal gets increased and the decay of it gets slower by adding aniracetam to these AMPA receptors.
So memory is famously benefited by people getting enough sleep. And if you learn something shortly before you go to sleep, you have a much better chance of remembering it a few days later than if you learn it maybe first thing in the day, go all day, and then don't sleep until late. Since aniracetam can have somewhat of a stimulant effect for a lot of people that might preclude their immediately taking a nap, how do these two things work together?
Yeah, well, the thing about aniracetam is if I'm trying to get some work done late at night, I can't just rely on coffee because coffee will keep me awake, but my brain will only be working enough to just look at silly cat pictures or something like that. But if I take some Nexus when I'm working late at night, I can get work done. The thing is that aniracetam, it certainly increases neuronal excitation, but it's pretty short-lived, lasts for about 4 hours. That's pretty short acting, so it's not going to keep you up unless you take it right before bed.
So talk a little bit about CDP choline and aniracetam and how those two work together. There's sort of a famous back and forth relationship between the racetams and the cholines.
AMPA receptors activation causes dopamine and acetylcholine release. Therefore, supplementing with acetylcholine helps support that. Also, supplementing with choline increases the amount of choline available for acetylcholine synthesis and prevents the body breaking down neuronal membranes to get acetylcholine for its various uses. And the good thing about CDP choline, too, is that it increases levels of choline in the brain, but it also increases levels of uridine in the brain. And there's actually a lot of research about the synergistic connection between uridine and choline and fish oil.
So basically, make sure that you get some fish oil with your Nexus in the mornings. Yeah, do be careful if you're going to take Nexus throughout the day, if not to carry fish oil around unguarded in your pocket. I've had more than one disastrous occasion when I had a fish oil pill in my pocket that broke at some point during the day. And it's like, well, what am I smelling right now? Oh, no.
Another interesting thing about aniracetam is that it's been very beneficial in monkey studies where they've done this thing called delayed match to sample. And what that is they give a monkey aniracetam and then they sit in a chair and they show it a picture, and then a few seconds later they show it a couple different pictures to choose from. And if it matches the picture, it gets a little treat, like some juice or something like that.
This is like the memory game that we used to play as kids, only for monkeys?
Yeah, and this is really easy for people, but it's a little harder for monkeys. And this is a very short-term memory task that's kind of demonstrating improvement in working memory. And they also do it with pigeons. Pigeons aren't as smart as monkeys, so they give them an even simpler task where they show them a colored tile and then they have to pick from another set of tiles and pick the right color.
Subjectively, my feelings about aniracetam line up really well with that, because I've always kind of felt like it was a creativity enhancer for me and it made me feel like multitasking. One of the things about multitasking, or at least quickly shifting between tasks, is that ability to hold more things in your short-term memory than you might otherwise be able to.
Yeah, and it increases the speed at which thoughts can develop. When I'm being creative or I'm trying to figure something out, that would be kind of an interpretation of the increase in those postsynaptic potentials, that these thoughts, instead of taking a lot of repeated stimulation to develop, they develop more easily. If I really need to concentrate, I'll take Zembrin Siltef stack, but that makes me not really enjoy people. Makes me just get really bored interacting with people. I just want to go home and study.
Yeah, that's interesting. Now, I've found actually that when I've taken Nexus and been around people, it's been completely fun, enjoyable. I feel like there is a little bit of a mood boost. I guess I got that from aniracetam in general too, but yeah, I do feel like a slight twinge of euphoria sometimes.
If I'm having a day where I'm doing a lot of social interaction, I usually take rhodiola. That prevents me from getting stressed out. I mean, rhodiola has this great effect where it basically stops cortisol increases, and that's the main stress hormone that makes one feel burnt out.
Yeah, I'm a fan of rhodiola as well.
Rhodiola is great. I love rhodiola, but it's more for a mood stack than for a mitochondrial energy or a cognitive enhancement stack. But even though it is an adaptogen and it improves the body's tolerance for stress, for example.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the adaptogens seem like they hit so many different things at once because they've got multiple active ingredients, sometimes, dozens upon dozens probably of active ingredients, and it's not even always clear which one's doing what.
Yeah, but some people, they're really sensitive to choline or CDP choline, and they'll get cortisol increases from that. And in that case, combining rhodiola with that will help prevent that, at least in my experience.
That's a great note. So yeah, if somebody does come away with what they think might be a choline headache or something, then possibly adding some rhodiola to the stack is a way of counteracting that.
If it gives them some anxiety or puts them in a negative mood, this rhodiola would probably be good for counteracting that, because there was a study that said CEP choline increases plasma ACTH, and ACTH stimulates the adrenal glands, which then make cortisol.
And cortisol kind of has a bad rap because people think stress is automatically bad. I mean, cortisol is a highly useful hormone when a bear is chasing you or you need to do something fast. I mean, it saves the lives of animals that are in trouble, but what you don't want is the low levels of cortisol just constantly pumping through your bloodstream and keeping you in this stress state throughout your day.
Yeah, and you need cortisol just to function. I mean, at some level.
It helps wake you up in the morning. It's like an increase in cortisol levels that even sort of primes your body in the hour when you're asleep that you're about to get up.
Yeah, you just want to avoid getting too much cortisol, because that can lead to these constantly stressed out burnout feeling. It's better to avoid, in my experience.
Looking through the 4 ingredients in Nexus, 3 of them, basically everything except CDP choline, has significant beneficial memory effects. Pycnogenol too. In fact, I was just looking at this. Pycnogenol improved working memory in the elderly. I mean, I wasn't really thinking of it so much as a memory stack, but I mean, is that a fair way to characterize it?
The mechanism of pycnogenol is that it's a antioxidant, increases the effects of, antioxidants like the SOD proteins in the brain. And, that cuts down on damage just from the normal functioning of the brain. And it also has, a moderating effect on, nitric oxide, which is also a neurotransmitter in the brain. It's interesting neurotransmitter because it's a gas, so it just goes in all directions and permeates membranes really easily. And just a memory and cognition enhancement stack. It's more targeted at the AMPA receptor and that early long-term potentiation phase of memory.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So thank you so very much to Abelard Lindsay for taking the time for that conversation about Nexus. Every time that I've spoken with Abelard, I've always kind of wished I could take a time machine back and talk with the earlier version of him before he had gotten into nootropics. Because he's really spoken about it being a major change in his own mental capabilities, performance, and I would love to be able to have met the before and after and kind of see that transition. It's hard to imagine him as not being this guy with an encyclopedic knowledge of all of these compounds and how they interrelate with one another. Probably part of it is him having the pseudonym, but I always kind of think of him as like this Batman-like figure in the way that Batman sits over Gotham City up on some building at night watching for crimes to happen. I think of Abelard sitting there watching for obscure posts on PubMed, waiting to find some little-known piece of data and how it might interconnect with something that he read 2 years ago. And hey, wait a minute, here's a new way to facilitate this biochemical pathway that nobody's ever noticed before. But anyway, thank you very much to Abelard for the interview. And now let's move on to the ruthless listener retention gimmick.
Smart Drug Smarts. Ruthless listener retention gimmick.
All right, let me put a little bit of a fig leaf on this one and say that I almost didn't make this a ruthless listener retention gimmick. I was like, is this really episode worthy? But then I realized that a lot of times there's not a whole lot of difference between the kind of stuff that we do for This Week in Neuroscience and the ruthless listener retention gimmick, and that it's okay. I need to give myself license to be a little bit weird and shamelessly entertainment oriented for the ruthless listener retention gimmick, because it's a gimmick after all. So anyway, I got this article sent to me. I thought this was pretty hilarious and pretty weird and just like, But somehow, a guy named Trevor L. Case got funding to do a study on mothers' preference for the smell of human feces. In this case, the smell of their own baby's feces versus some other baby's feces. This was a real study. This was done back in 2005. And possibly not surprisingly, certainly not as surprising as the fact that they were able to get the study funded, mothers prefer the smell of their own baby's poop. In a series of trials, the mothers of infants were presented with concealed samples of their own baby's feces-soiled diapers and then those of somebody else's baby. They swapped the labels, they mislabeled them, they didn't label some of them, they did all sorts of controls, and the studies provided compelling evidence that mothers regard their own baby's fecal smell as less disgusting than the feces of someone else's baby. One can imagine the evolutionary advantage of not being grossed out by one's infants, so you can see why this might be the case. It is not clear from the study whether this is a learned behavior, like they've already gotten used to the smell of their baby's feces, so it's not quite as gross, or if the mothers can somehow identify from the smell of the feces the fact that this baby is related to them. There have been similar studies, not involving feces, that mothers prefer the smell of their own flesh and blood babies versus those of stepchildren, so apparently there's something pheromonal going on there, but it's not known whether the same holds true with baby poop. So the next time you're hanging around a young mom and she's complaining about changing diapers, you can point out with a knowing smile that at least she's not having to change some other kid's diapers.
Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast so smart, we have smart in our title twice.
Okay, that is the entire episode. Thank you for hanging around until the end. If you enjoyed Smart Drug Smarts, please tell a friend. Really want to thank you once again for making August our biggest ever month. I know that there's a lot of other stuff people have to do during the summer months, and the fact that you're taking your time out to listen to an episode here and there is a major mood enhancer for little old me. The show notes for this episode will be online at smartdrugsmarts.com, including the links to everything that we talked about here. And probably needless to say, axonlabs.io is the easiest place online to find Nexus, the star stack of this episode. I'll be back at you next week with an episode of unknown origins. I'm not exactly sure what it's going to be yet. It might be acetylcholine. It might be another Know Your Neurotransmitters episode. But I'm going to have to leave you guessing because I don't know yet myself. Anyway, that'll be next week on Smart Drug Smarts. But as usual, until then, have a great week and stay smart.
You've been listening to the Smart Drug Smarts podcast. Visit us online at www.smartdrugsmarts.com and subscribe to our mailing list to keep your neurons buzzing with the latest in brain optimization. Smart Drug Smarts should be listened to for entertainment purposes only. Although some guests on the show are medical doctors, most are not, and the host is just some random guy. Nothing you hear on this podcast or read at smartdrugsmarts.com should be considered medical advice. Consult your doctor and use some damn common sense before doing anything you think might have a lasting impact on your brain.